Chapter 21 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. Chapter 21. The Race with the Storm. It seemed to most of the thousands of lookers-on as though both biplanes left the green at the same instant. And as they speedily soared upward, it was impossible for any one among those left behind to positively decide whether either one of the rivals had the slightest lead. Of course, a hurricane of shouts had broken loose the very second there came a forward movement. It was as though the repressed enthusiasm of the vast throng had refused longer to remain bottled up, and just had to find a vent. Still, that volume of sound would prove but a shadow to the wild outburst by which the ultimate victor might expect to be greeted when he came in later on. Frank saw that his rival was right there alongside when they had sped swiftly over what might be 5 miles, and it took very few minutes to accomplish this part of the race too. "He's holding us, Frank," shouted Andy nervously. "I know it. Don't let that worry you," was the composed reply he received. "But why don't you let go and eat up ahead?" demanded the other again presently, when he had kept watching the progress of the second biplane and calculating the distance between them. Truth to tell, Andy was so suspicious of Percy that he felt a constant dread lest the other might play some dastardly trick, meaning to thus gain an advantage. Of course, no one could guess what the nature of this game might be, but he had the reputation of being a slick one. And among boys that signifies a fellow who never hesitates to apply mean tactics rather than accept a square beat. In that case, the sooner they put on a spurt and left their rival behind, the better Andy would like it. "I'm waiting to study his way of doing things first," Frank answered, as steadily as though they were seated in the shop discussing arrangements. "Just hold your horses a bit, and we'll start something. I'm nearly ready to begin showing what our new engine can do." So the impatient Andy had to keep his eagerness in check, although his very heart seemed to be eating itself with suspense. Then he caught a quick breath. Frank moved his hand clutching the speed lever. They had immediately commenced to increase their forward motion to a perceptible extent. Anxiously did Andy glue his eyes on the other aeroplane, and for a brief time he seemed to almost hold his breath as he watched to see whether they would leave it behind, with Percy desperately endeavoring to copy their spurt. Looking thus, he had seen Percy instantly imitate the action of the other, proving that he too had been keeping a little extra speed in reserve. And as the minutes passed, Andy failed to discover the slightest difference in the relative positions of the two airships. "Frank, it didn't go," he cried, with beads of perspiration on his forehead, due not to the heat of the afternoon, for they were making lots of circulation in the stagnant air by their rapid progress, but because of intense emotion. "That's so," Andy replied the pilot, "but perhaps the second time it may be more successful." "Oh, have you any more held back then?" asked Andy in a trembling voice, from which he could not, however, keep out the tone of joy. "A little. Wait till we are 2/3 of the way there, and then watch out." They talked no more. It was difficult, to say the least, when going at such a frightful pace through the air. Andy divided his time watching first the nearby aeroplane, which Percy was so skillfully guiding toward the haven ahead, and then turning his attention toward the western sky. That low bank of clouds had commenced to move upward now. Yes, and when Andy looked, he could see the sudden wicked gleam of the zigzag lightning as it shot athwart the black masses. No doubt he experienced a certain amount of anxiety concerning the coming of that summer storm. It would be only natural that he should, for if the aeroplanes were ever caught in the sweep of the furious tornado, they would be as straws, to be toppled over and over to the ground far below. But the fever of the race had full possession of Andy by now, and even given a chance to descend, it is doubtful whether he would have availed himself of it. Perhaps the storm would hold off long enough to allow them to complete the conditions of the event. And anyway, so long as Percy chose to take the chances, it must not be for them to give up and let him crow over them by finishing alone. Was Frank affected in the same way as his cousin? Perhaps to some extent. But he would have welcomed a proposition from Percy looking to the calling off of the contest to another and better day. If no such bail came, Frank might deem it his duty to keep on. Now they were approaching Hazenhurst, that is, they could easily see the many houses of the town and the commons near the center. "Another big crowd waiting there to see us turn the Liberty Pole," ventured Andy, who had been using the glasses a brief time before, perhaps in the vague hope of being able to discover a certain fluttering handkerchief among the waving hundreds that had a familiar face behind it. "I guess it's about time we took the lead if we can," observed Frank. He had no sooner spoken these words than Andy felt the sudden change of pace, for it seemed to him that the biplane actually jumped forward. When he heard loud shouts of rage and chagrin from the direction of the other aeroplane, he did not need to be told that Percy had no further speed to let loose, and that he recognized the fact of sure defeat staring him in the face unless fortune proved kind and brought about some accident to Frank's machine. If what Percy must be wishing in his heart just then could only be realized, no doubt the leading biplane would crumple up and drop to the ground like a crippled bird. But no such event came to pass. Frank continued to slowly but steadily gain on his competitor. He knew that undoubtedly Percy was trying, by every means possible, to increase the power of his engine, already taxed to the utmost limit. "How is it now?" asked Frank, as they began to gradually descend, so as to get within the proper distance from the earth at the time they made the sweep around the Liberty Pole. "Still gaining a foot at a time," shouted the exultant Andy, who thought things could hardly have been better for him, if they were allowed to pass around that stake with their rival trailing in the rear, for surely she would see him there in the limelight, and he was eager to pick Miss Alice out of those many hundreds gathered to cheer the plucky air navigators on their way. Now they could hear the hoarse shouts that arose. All Hazenhurst had apparently gathered for this grand spectacle of man conquering the air. It was an inspiring sight, and while the younger element cheered madly, the older people gazed in sheer awe at seeing what most of them had up to now doubted could ever come to pass. Frank was keenly awake to everything. He did not mean to make any mistake at this critical moment. It was the part of wisdom to circle around the Liberty Pole at quite a little distance. Likely enough Percy would be more reckless and cut in closer, hoping in that way to make up a little of his lost ground. Very well, let him, if so be he chose to take chances. The Bird Boys had the better machine. There could now be no doubt of that in Frank's mind. And as they had been able to gain while on the forward leg, the same conditions could be made to prevail when on the homeward stretch. One thing alone troubled Frank. He realized that it was folly in them to think of carrying out the part of the conditions to call for 3 circles around the peak of Old Thundertop before heading for the high school campus on the last stage of the race. And after they were well on the way toward home, he meant to hail Percy to propose that they combine to cut that risky part of the performance out. A joint agreement would settle it, and doubtless the judges would hail that decision as part of prudence. Human lives were worth more than empty honors, and while the gathered thousands might be cheated out of a thrilling sight as they stood and looked toward far-off Thundertop, still few would complain. Would Percy agree? That was where Frank felt doubtful. He knew the nature of the other only too well. Perhaps Percy would flaunt it in his face that he was a coward. Possibly he would declare that as for him, he meant to circle the mountain top those 3 times, no matter if the storm did catch him, and having done his duty, would snatch the victory from his weak-hearted rival. Now the Liberty Pole loomed up half a mile ahead, but the next clap of thunder was certainly louder than any preceding one had been. Still, the storm would be behind them in heading for home, and hence they might keep ahead of it, if only they did not dally in the neighborhood of Old Thundertop. Frank had settled down to the proper distance from the ground. Having been here before, he knew whether any obstacle would present itself in making that swoop around the tall mast. Not for a single instant must he allow his eyes to leave the object of his flight. Andy could observe what was transpiring below, but to the young pilot of the biplane, his only recollection would be a hazy one of a multitude of upturned faces, a wilderness of fluttering handkerchiefs and flags together with hats thrown into the air, and the whole accompanied by stentorian cheers from thousands of throats. With scarcely any perceptible slackening of his fearful speed, the leading aviator swept in a graceful curve around the big Liberty Pole, and having made the complete circuit, once more headed off toward distant Bloomsbury, with the gathering storm grumbling and growling in the rear. Andy was happy for the moment, and he thought he had good reason to be, In the first place, they had met Percy going in while they were coming out, though Frank had wisely given his reckless rival plenty of swinging room, not wishing to have a head-on collision. Then again, Andy had positively caught sight of that pretty rosy countenance that he had seen pale with fear the other day, at the time he'd stood between Miss Alice and that savage bulldog. Yes, she was there, just where she had promised to be, with the mayor alongside, and how her dainty little handkerchief did wave to and fro when the daring bird boys were making their circuit of the Liberty Pole. Gradually the shouts of the enthusiastic Hazenhurst people grew fainter in the distance, for when going at the rate of a mile a minute, it does not take long to lose even such a vast volume of sound. Frank determined to put the little plan he had in mind into practice. Better speak to Percy while the opportunity was still open. So he slowed down just a trifle. "Frank, they're gaining," shrilled Andy in new alarm. "I want them to," answered the other. "I cut off some of our speed on purpose to let him come up where I can shout out to him." The second biplane was now close alongside. Andy could see the faces of those aboard, and noted the fact that they were flush with the new hope that Frank had shot his bolt, and that his engine was now going back on him. Waiting until the other was on about even terms, Frank called out as loudly as he could, "Hello, Percy!" "Well, what do you want?" came back the surly answer. "Don't you think it's next door to foolish for us to head up to the peak with that storm coming swooping after us? Suppose we make straight for the campus and call it a race. Another day we can fix it to make the try over again." Frank was very doubtful even while shouting this proposition, and just as he feared, Percy chose to look upon it as a sign of weakening. "You can do what you please," he called back with a shrill laugh. "I know that I'm going around the top my 3 times. If you're afraid, back down and make for the town. We'll see who's got the most nerve right now. Get that?" End of chapter 21.